Hello and welcome to Now More Questions, the interview series on European affairs that gets conversation started. In today's episode, we'll be going deep underground to discuss the issue of critical raw materials. Since March 2023 and the publication of the European Commission's Critical Raw Materials Act, there's been a lot of talk around town and a lot of excitement at the prospect of the EU gaining more sovereignty over its raw material supply, whether that would be through local mining projects, through the recycling of waste in Europe, or through securing global supply chain partnerships. It seems that even environmental NGOs who would be typically cautious about excavation and mining projects recognize that the major transformation of our society towards the development of digital technologies and electrification or renewable energy are worth the mining effort. After having spoken with Rolf Kubi from Euromines and Diego Marin from the European Environmental Bureau, we decided to hear from those who are actually closest to the materials themselves, geologists. That is why I am pleased to introduce Julie Hollis to the show. Julie is the Secretary General of EuroGeoSurveys, a non-profit organization representing 37 European geological surveys. She has a PhD in geology and a master's in science communication and public engagement, both from the University of Edinburgh. And she's worked in leading governance and senior management roles in academia, geological surveys, and government in Belgium, Denmark, Greenland, and Australia. Julie, thanks a lot for taking the time to be with us, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
So in the tradition of Now More Questions, we kick off the interview with a question from the previous speaker. That was Liga Rosenthaler. She's an independent expert on cybersecurity, and she was interviewed on the topic of defense of democracy.
First of all, I'm very interested in the looking at dwindling resources in critical raw materials. Is it best to address this challenge through innovation and new technology, or is it better to work on international cooperation and kind of pairing between democracies and authorities to try to balance the use of these materials?
I think the short answer is both. There's not one way to address the challenges that we're facing with critical raw materials, and particularly given the situation in Europe where supply chains are under a great deal of pressure, it's essential that we use whatever means we have available. That includes international partnerships, it includes boosting domestic supply, it includes recycling, readdressing mining waste, and it also includes reducing consumption as well. All of those things.
So we can act in many ways on this issue. Now to just kick off this interview, I mean, it's the first time I interview a geologist, actually, and really just as a starting point, because maybe people don't necessarily think of geology as, the first science that informs policy. But can you just give us a sense of how geology is informing policy today?
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that maybe people don't think of geology particularly, and I think that's one of our biggest problems as geologists is that unfortunately most people don't really know very much about geology, and there are a number of reasons for that, and one in particular is that in many countries in the world geology is not taught in school anymore. And that means that as geologists, we are in a pretty tricky position as a starting point to inform policy, because we're often talking to people who don't know the broad spectrum of what geology encompasses and don't have a particularly strong idea of why it's relevant. But it's very relevant to so many different aspects of society and people's lives. Most particularly at the moment, a lot of geologists are really keen to try and boost our ability to inform policy because of all of the many ways in which geoscience can inform on climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I know we're talking about critical raw materials in this podcast, and that's certainly an important part of it. But geology also needs to inform on things like groundwater. Groundwater sits in the rocks beneath our feet. On monitoring quality and quantity of groundwater, also on things like developing renewable energy such as geothermal, making our cities and other infrastructure more sustainable, because our cities, a lot of city infrastructure is actually under the ground. And then there's also a lot of talk about, for example, carbon capture and storage. This relates to storage of carbon underground, but also storage of hydrogen fuel and compressed air for renewable energies as well. And then there's also informing on all of the climate impacts, increasing climate impacts that geology is relevant to. For example, flooding and drought, landslides, land subsidence, all of these things are affected by climate changes and require a knowledge of geology. So in terms of how we actually do that, as you mentioned, I work for EuroGeoSurveys, which represents the geological survey organizations of Europe. And most countries have a geological survey, which usually sits under a Ministry of Finance or Environment or Industry. And the purpose of those organizations is primarily to understand the geology of that country, collect and provide geological data and advice specifically to serve the government and the public. So it's a primary mandate of geological survey organizations to inform policy at national level. And at EU level, EuroGeoSurveys aims to do the same thing by drawing on the expertise that we have at national level and applying this at European scale to address the EU policy agenda. So experts from our organisation and from the national organisations sit on expert scientific advisory boards that directly inform the Commission on things like soil health, raw materials and groundwater. And EuroGeoSurveys also regularly responds to the public consultations in areas where we have expertise, for example, again, like the proposed Soil Health Law, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, and so on. And we also keep close ties with different parts of the European Commission so that we know what's happening in regard to EU policy, and then we can be present at relevant events and respond either when advice is asked for or when we think that it's needed.
So you're offering an important competence to policymakers, even if what you're saying is that this is, maybe under threat because it's no longer really taught in school, as you mentioned. So there's a threat in a way, but you're offering an important competence for policymaking on many different fronts, not just critical raw materials. When it comes to critical raw materials, what I understand to be critical is not just the question of whether or not the resource in question is available as such, but it's also, how are the markets functioning? How are the different, geopolitical factors being addressed in accessing or not these resources? So there are all sorts of other considerations beyond the actual resource itself when we talk about critical raw materials. As a geologist, how would you categorize actually a critical raw material? And do you agree with the way they are defined by European policymakers in the Critical Raw Materials Act? Or do you think there are some factors that are missing in the assessment of what is a critical raw material?
Okay, well, as you say, there's a lot of attention paid to this concept of critical raw materials, particularly mineral and metal raw materials. And so this is a suite of raw materials that are both important to the economy and they have high supply chain risk, either because there's a shortage or a concentration in particular countries. And also where there's a lack of alternatives because they have unique properties and applications. Of course, for example, lithium and graphite in batteries, for example. And as you say, these concepts defined in the Critical Raw Materials Act, with the purpose of ultimately building more resilience into supply chains, particularly because of some of the challenges in recent years relating to export restrictions and the Russian war and so on. From a geological perspective, the geological community are actually very much involved in advising on the science behind which materials should be considered critical, and that includes many of our member organisations and experts from those organisations. In addition to drawing on the available data from whatever reliable sources are available, there is, as a part of the EU process, a lot of consultation with industry and scientific experts to feed into these criticality assessments. And so, in my view, from a geological perspective, I think it is consistent with what a lot of geologists would consider to be critical. One thing that, of course, this is always changing. It's region dependent and so on. So, of course, the list of US critical minerals is a bit different from what it is in Europe, and it will also be slightly different from country to country. I guess from a geological perspective, I would also say that while we're talking about largely mineral raw materials here, it is important to remember that these are not the only critical resources from a geological perspective. One other that immediately springs to mind that I know that there's an enormous amount of focus on in the geological survey community is water. This is a big focus for geological survey organisations and other related agencies around the world. In Europe, for example, groundwater provides around 65% of our drinking water and 25% of the water that we use for agriculture. And we have already surpassed the planetary boundary for freshwater change. So it is really important to consider that there are other resources that, as geologists, we also consider to be critical, and there's a lot of work going on there as well.
Yeah, and that's maybe harder to link to a specific industry or a specific sort of political project as such, whereas here what we're talking about with the critical raw materials is linked to, notably the green and digital transition that everyone is talking about, and so there are very specific materials that are being looked for. And I think it's interesting what you say about water, and it brings me to another thought that's maybe a little bit simplistic or caricatural, but it's true that we do hear very much about this notion of planetary boundaries and resource depletion, and the European Commission itself is very vocal about these and has advocated a lot around things like the circular economy and recirculating resources that are available in the economy. And there seems to me to be a bit of a disconnect then when we talk about critical raw materials, where we're basically saying that I think it's something like 80%, if not more, of our resources will need to come from new extraction, new mining projects, and so and people seem to be really positive about this, which seems very much in contradiction with this notion of planetary boundaries. So I just wanted to get your view on that. I mean, is it a contradiction, or is it too simplistic to just put these two concepts in opposition?
No, it's certainly worth thinking about. I don't think it's entirely simple. Planetary boundaries are very much a concept that a lot of geologists work on, where there is a lot of research, particularly because from a geological perspective, the Earth system, which incorporates minerals and energy and water, is all interconnected. It's a whole lot of interdependent processes. So, for example, the flooding events in Slovenia earlier this year caused a massive number of landslides, and this is related to climate changes, and it has impacts on people. All of these things are basically interconnected. So, in regard to planetary boundaries, unfortunately, we're doing fairly badly in that in that sphere on a number of levels. But coming back to your question about depleting resources, yes, absolutely, we are depleting the Earth's resources. But nonetheless, if we want to actually slow down and adapt to climate change, we also need to increase mine production. And I think that's widely accepted now, even amongst groups who you might not necessarily immediately think might feel okay about that. But at least for an interim period, in order to develop the green technologies that we need, in order to change our energy systems, we simply need to increase mine production of critical raw materials until we can get to this point where circularity and recycling efforts are much more efficient than they are today. And so that's really I guess the area of the Critical Raw Materials Act where this is taken into account, is trying to boost those activities as well, so that once these materials start moving through the supply chains and entering into the new infrastructure and energy systems that we're using, that we will then in future not be so heavily reliant on mining in order to renew these materials.
It would be interesting to know whether similar arguments may have been made in the past when the Industrial Revolution was powered through coal, and maybe similar arguments would have been made at the time to say well, I mean, obviously maybe without the similar knowledge that we might have today, but still this idea that every transition requires some kind of new fuel or new material, and therefore we have to accommodate a certain lapse of time where we're doing a little bit of harm and we're hoping for a greater good later. Would that be a fair characterization?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a transition period for sure. It's a period where transitioning from one set of societal infrastructure to another. So absolutely, it's not seen as something that should continue into the future, or that is likely to be viable to do so. So yeah, I think that's the case.
You mentioned that indeed some environmental NGOs also seem to accept the necessity, and I've certainly picked up on this. One area that there still might be some debate on is how do you mine, and what is a kind of a responsible mining project, especially in terms of global supply chains. Where are you mining, and what kind of conditions are people working in, for instance, in those mines? Maybe less on the human conditions, but maybe more on the actual material conditions. What is for you responsible mining? What is the kind of the main ingredients, the checklist for responsible mining?
I think the easiest way to answer that is to look at the UN framework classification for raw materials. So you probably know that there are a lot of existing mining codes in the world. For example, JORC and 43101 and SAMREC is used in South Africa and so on. And a lot of these are actually quite similar. And they're all, in fact, based around the concept of defining resources and reserves, which means collecting a lot of geological and practical feasibility and economic information about a mineral deposit, with the ultimate aim of defining, with increasing certainty, the economic feasibility of mining. So economic viability is really at the center of most of those codes. And while this is also incorporated into the UN Framework Classification, UNFC, but actually the fundamental premise of UNFC is not so much about economics, but about sustainability. And this arose from an ambition through resource projects to contribute to achieving the sustainability goals. So instead of this main focus on economic feasibility, the focus is on environmental, social, and economic feasibility. And of course, you don't have to use UNFC in order to produce a responsible mining operation, but it is a useful base. And in the EU, it's now seeing a much greater uptake, and this is likely to be much more so in future because it's in the Critical Raw Materials Act. It's actually a requirement of some components of the Act. But getting down to what actually a responsible mining operation would look like, it would certainly involve social acceptance or social license to operate, where the local community actually wants a mine, assessing and mitigating the negative environmental impacts, and establishing a sound governance structure for the whole project, and UNFC and also other mining codes as well, but UNFC takes account of all of this. And particularly regarding this UNFC code or classification, it's actually been developed not just to assess the viability of mining projects, but also other resource projects as well. So it can be applied to oil and gas, geothermal energy, groundwater, hydrogen, nuclear power, and anthropogenic projects, so remining of waste and so on. So anyway, the sustainability goals are really a completely different kind of philosophy from the traditional concept of economic viability of resources. But as I say, there's still plenty of excellent modern mining projects with high standards, which don't necessarily use this as their base. But yeah, and if you look, for example, at some of the Scandinavian mining operations, there are some excellent examples of modern mining in that area. And for example, in Sweden, the industry itself has an ambition of achieving net biodiversity gain through mining activity by 2030. And there's also a lot of drive towards achieving net zero mining through mining processes and products, and that's actually been driven by the industry there, which is very positive. And as I say, responsible mining is not just about net zero; it's also about social acceptance, but also the highest standards of safety and digitalization and remote mining, because these also increase safety and allow greater efficiencies in mining as well.
Because obviously mining has a long tradition in Europe, in our literature. I mean, it's a little bit sort of parked there in the 17th, 18th century, but there is a long tradition, and it feels that with this Critical Raw Materials Act, there's a sort of a return of mining in Europe. I don't know where the social acceptance is at. To be honest, there seems to be a few projects opening, but also a bit of protest in some other areas in Europe. Do you think that Europe has somehow a little bit neglected its mining capacity over the years, and this also explains why we're in this situation where we need this Critical Raw Materials Act to boost mining in Europe? Or is it simply that the materials that we need are just actually not in Europe? I mean, what do we know about actually what is in Europe compared to what we need to power the political projects that we have here?
Okay, so first of all, yes, we have absolutely neglected our mining capacities in Europe. The mining sector has faded from being more than 60% of the world's mining activity in the 1800s in Europe to being about 15% in the middle of last century, and today around 3%, which is less than any other populated continent. And in the last 20 years, Europe is the only continent where mining production has decreased, and in fact, it's decreased by more than 30%. So this is really the primary reason why we now find ourselves in the situation that Europe has these very uncomfortable supply chain dependencies on other countries. For example, we depend on China for more than 99% of our rare earth element supply, and around 70% of our cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which the EU has just recently signed an MOU on raw materials with. But regarding whether we actually have the resources in Europe, it's not because we didn't have the resources that we stopped mining and exploring. It's because it was easier and cheaper to do it somewhere else. But that is no longer the case. And as to whether we actually have the resources, the answer is simply we don't know. Undoubtedly, we would find additional resources if there was more investment in an effort in exploring. And if we look at our current situation in relation to the exploration and mining that was done in Europe in the past, before the mining sector shrank so significantly, many of the elements or materials that are critical today were actually not explored for and extracted a few decades ago. For example, lithium and rare earth elements were not a focus at all. And deep and undercover potential for mineral deposits is still quite poorly known in Europe. So there's still a lot of information missing on whether we actually have these resources or not. Of course, we have competing challenges of land uses, such as urban development, transport, agriculture, industry, and other infrastructure, and also nature preservation. And so those are some additional challenges in exploring in Europe. But now, under the Critical Raw Materials Act, renewed exploration activity and data is actually required to be carried out by the member states, and that will actually largely be work that involves the National Geological Survey organisations. And the generation of new knowledge of the geology and the mineral potential of Europe will almost certainly promote new exploration, commercial exploration investment, and hopefully new discoveries. But one thing also that I think is really important to remember in regard to exploration and discovery of new deposits is assessing what we already know. For example, it's common knowledge that in the geological exploration community that the best place to find a new mineral deposit is next to an old one. There was an Australian study done on the success rates of exploration in Australia some years ago that estimated the success rates for exploration in greenfields areas. So that's grassroots exploration in areas that haven't been much explored. And the success rate of exploration there was about 0.3%, which means only about 1 in 330 exploration projects will make a discovery. And only a fraction of those will end up being a mine. So exploration is an enormously risky business. But if you're exploring in a brownfields area, so that's an area in close proximity to existing or previous mining activity, the success rate was about 5%, which is much, much higher, about 1 in 20. And there's a lot of historic mining activity in Europe where renewed activity could potentially take place. And then there's also the existing resources of mine waste in Europe, of which there is a very large volume that are also now required to be reassessed by member states under the Critical Raw Materials Act. And these are also drawing the interest of companies, a lot of new companies who are looking at applying new technologies and looking for resources in those waste dumps. Some waste dumps may contain resources that were never looked at in the first instance of mining. So there are definitely possibilities for increasing domestic production in Europe, but it does require a lot of investment and a lot of work.
Yeah, because out of curiosity, just to get an idea, when you talk about exploration, what are we talking about? How deep are we at this point? Maybe it differs according to, whatever strata you're looking at or whatever mineral you're looking for, but can you give us a sense of how deep are we actually in the Earth's crust?
You're completely right. It depends enormously what you're looking for. It varies from deposits which are likely to be in the shallow subsurface, and those are more likely to have been found, of course, to deposits that I'm not sure quite how deep mining actually extends in current mines in Europe, but we're talking up to a couple of kilometres, certainly a kilometre depth. So it varies a great deal. And when it comes to deeper mining, there's a lot less deep mining that has happened. And this also, in order to find deep deposits, you really need to have high quality geophysical data, and a lot of that data is still actually not available for many parts of Europe. It just simply hasn't been flown or is very old, and new data collection is likely to produce new insights into the potential for deep deposits.
So there's still a lot of uncharted territory that we still need to explore, and I guess probably around the world. I mean, even if we may have a little bit less knowledge in Europe, I'm sure there's still a lot of uncharted territory out there. One thing I'd like to pick up on, I mean, you mentioned the issue of mining waste and the fact that there could be some resources there that some companies will be looking at. This also brings me to a question around waste, actually, because this seems to be one of the things that is also a little bit underestimated, in my view. When we talk about these big transitions, we imply that there will be new products coming into the market, and here it's typically, digital products, but also those products that are powering the energy transition, whether these are, composite materials in wind turbines or what have you. And we don't always have a vision on how we will treat these products once they reach their end of life, maybe in 20 years, 30 years, whatever that is. And again, it brings us back a little bit to geology and what you were saying at the beginning, that you're covering a wide range of issues. Do you see problems coming our way in 20, 30, 40 years' time coming from precisely the digital and green transition when it comes to products becoming waste, and the kind of effect that might have, if not properly managed, on maybe water contamination, soil contamination, all sorts of things that will be affecting our environment, our Earth, let's say, and that we're not maybe anticipating enough in your view? Is that a concern that you have?
I think it's always a concern, and I think we've already got ourselves into a lot of trouble in that regard. But now I would say there's actually a huge amount of research and attention being paid to waste management, and certainly that needs to happen. When it comes to geologists, our main involvement is in regard to waste, is in regard to mine waste, as I mentioned, and the potential for remining. And there's likely to be a lot more activity there in the future, also because of the CRM Act in Europe. And there are also a lot of new technologies available today that would allow extraction of more raw materials from waste. And as I mentioned, it's not just governments, the national governments are required to look at this regarding mining waste, but there are also a lot of companies looking at this from a business perspective as well. So a lot of attention there, and a lot of potential, I think. Also, and one of the benefits of actually doing that is also the potential for rehabilitation of some of those mine dumps as well. In terms of modern mining, such as is really exemplified, I think, in Scandinavia, there's also this concept of zero waste. That's an ambition of the mining industry, actively working towards using everything possible from mined material with the aim of achieving zero waste. And that may ultimately be impossible, but I think it's an excellent ambition to have. In terms of waste from more downstream products, it's not so much the field of where many geologists work, but I do know that there is research work and EU level policy work going on, trying to map all of these waste streams. Some of our members are involved in those projects which look at really the upstream end of things, but this is trying to map waste streams right throughout the supply chain to determine how to improve circularity, reuse, repair, recycling. including requirements to build circularity into the design of new products. And I think that's a really important area, of course, when we're thinking about future waste. You asked whether geologists are concerned about the impact on soils, for example, and of course we're very much engaged in studying the geochemistry of soils. In fact, the first pan-European map of soil geochemistry was the first collaborative project of EuroGeoSurveys, the GEMAS project, the geochemical mapping of agricultural and grazing land soil, carried out by our geochemistry expert group. And that's been quite important in identifying the different sources and activities impacting the geochemistry of European soils, which includes industrial waste and water contamination from anthropogenic and also natural sources, including the composition of the rocks themselves. And municipal and industrial waste certainly contribute to soil contamination. And of course, this is also very much a focus for the proposed soil health law and the expert consultations and public consultations from the commissions, which our geologists contribute to. So, yeah, it's certainly something that we pay attention to as well.
Okay, thank you. And to maybe finish on a broader note, then to come back to this point that you mentioned, maybe people don't know enough about what's going on in the world of geology, and if it's not taught at school, we'll know even less. So let's hope that there are a few students out there still keen to explore what the world has to offer. Could you give us a sense of what would be maybe, I don't know, the top sort of 3 key research priorities that you have, for instance, at EuroGeoSurveys, the key kind of areas that you're working on, just to give us a flavor of the issues?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'd like to say a few words about our flagship project, which is the Geological Service for Europe project. It's funded by the European Commission, and it involves 48 partners from 35 countries and hundreds of experts. And it covers a whole suite of areas that are relevant to the Green Deal. I would say that in essence, if you're asking for 3 things, what a lot of it boils down to, and this also relates to previous projects that we've had a lot of collaborative work on as well, is minerals, energy, and groundwater. So in this project, we are delivering harmonized EU-level data on raw materials, geoenergy, which includes geothermal potential, hydrogen storage, carbon capture, also groundwater quality and quantity. But we also look at coastal zone stability and wind farm siting and building the geological framework in a harmonized way to support all of this. And then delivering all of this data and knowledge through an open online platform. It's called the European Geological Data Infrastructure. And ultimately, what we hope to achieve is a permanently funded geological service, which we aim to be able to deliver these services and this data on an ongoing basis in order to help to deliver the goals of the Green Deal.
Okay, brilliant. And maybe just then a final one. Would you have some kind of research activity or project that you've been involved in, you personally or as an organization, that we might expect the least, that no one would possibly link that to geology, and yet there you were, is there one?
Well, yeah, there are probably quite a number of things like that, but one that I find people are often surprised by is our work on wind farm siting, where to put wind farms. And this is because we have a very active expert group in marine geology who've been working for years on a multidisciplinary project called IMODNet, which delivers free harmonized data about the European ocean environment. So we deliver the geology component of this. It's about the geology of the shallow seafloor, which is important for many reasons. And one, which I was also surprised to learn, is that the geology of the seafloor is the best proxy that we have for understanding what ecosystems are likely to exist on different parts of the seafloor. But as I say, it's also a key component, knowing the geology of the seafloor, to know where are the best places or even suitable places to put wind farms, which we need to continue to deliver in large numbers in order to contribute to our renewable energy needs.
Julie, thank you so much for having shared your insights from up to 1 kilometer underground. There's a lot of activities going on there, a lot of knowledge still to be explored, to be found, to be analyzed. But clearly, geology will have a major role to play to power all of these big political projects that we have in Europe. So thank you for having shared your thoughts on that.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that was Julie Hollis, Secretary General of EuroGeoSurveys, giving us insights on how geology is informing policy, and in particular the Critical Raw Materials Act, published by the European Commission. She considers that Europe has neglected its mining capacity, to some extent is at risk of neglecting the role of geology. If geology is no longer taught in school, will we have the geologists of tomorrow that will provide the knowledge that we actually don't have much of what's going on, of what resources are available in the Earth's crust? Where are they available? There seems to be a lot of exploration projects still to be developed in Europe and probably around the world. And if Europe is to be sovereign in an era where it is no longer a colonial power, and can no longer benefit from very cheap resources elsewhere in the world and bringing them back to Europe, maybe we need to accept some more mining, some more excavation projects. That might be tricky in some parts of Europe where there are many other clashing policies, such as, for instance, the preservation of nature and biodiversity, which Julie also mentioned. So a lot of difficult issues that were dealt with. That was our third interview on critical raw materials. You can compare and contrast them with what we heard from Rolf Kubi at Euromines and Diego Marin at the European Environmental Bureau. But I think we get a really full picture of the scenario where, yes, we need to excavate more, but this can be counterintuitive when it comes to the notion of planetary boundaries. What's it going to be? Well, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next episodes. Bye-bye.